with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show. Okay, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for checking in on Phronesis. And this is a very, very special episode. We are celebrating our 100th episode, Phronesis Practical Wisdom for Leaders. And for this 100th episode, we have a real treat. Dr. Ron Heifetz is with us. I'm going to give his short bio. The full bio is in the show notes, links to all of his books, some publications. It'll all be there. There's a learning experience called the Art and Practice of Leadership Development that you have to be aware of. There'll be a link to that resource. Ron is among the world's foremost authorities on the practice and teaching of leadership. He speaks extensively and advises heads of governments, businesses, and nonprofit organizations across the globe. Heifetz founded the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard Kennedy School, where he has taught for nearly 4 decades. Sir, thank you so much for being with us today. We really, really appreciate your time.
It's such a pleasure, Scott. It's great to be in conversation.
I had this learning experience in 2006. We were talking a little bit before we got on air here. And it's literally one of the most powerful learning experiences I've ever had, which was that experience in the Art and Practice of Leadership Development, that intensive, I believe it was 7 to 8 days in length. And we really, really explored adaptive leadership. We explored case-in-point methodology. And to this day, I will say that it was one of the most powerful learning experiences I've ever had. And I'm really excited to dive deep to start with Case-in-Point, because I'd love to know your perspectives on kind of the special sauce. What's going on in that learning experience that has a guy in Cleveland, like 13 years later, 14 years later, 15 years later, saying that was one of the most powerful learning experiences I've ever had? Because I know others feel the same. And I'd love to get your perspectives on the design of that, how you think about that, and why it's so powerful.
Thank you, Scott. I so appreciate that it was valuable to you. I so appreciate that. And I know Marty Linsky, who chaired the program, would be really thrilled to hear that. And I will pass that on to him as well. I developed Case-in-Point method of teaching right after my psychiatry residency, when I started teaching at the Kennedy School in 1983, and was charged with developing a method for leadership education. Yeah. Up till then, my particular school was, like most professional schools, hadn't assumed that leadership could not be taught, that people were born leaders, not made, and you really couldn't teach it. So instead, let's teach people what we know how to teach, financial management, organizational strategy, public policy, economics, and statistical reasoning, and so forth. So the school decided to run this experiment and hiring me to work this way. And it seemed to me, based on my medical training, I started off training in medicine, that practical education in practice, for practice, not for describing things, not for just analyzing things.
Yes.
Which academics are trained for. But trainings in a professional school for professional practice was generally done by getting people to learn from experience.
Yes.
You might go to, like in medical school, you might go to classes for a year and a half or 2 years, but very quickly they try to get you to experience things. Even anatomy, that you don't only learn it from beautiful graphics, which now are three-dimensional on a computer that you can rotate, but you have to look inside a real body. And indeed, medical training itself builds from the original form of practical education in all of human societies, which is apprenticeship.
Yes.
People may have a talent for climbing trees, and as in a hunter and gatherer society that's looking for honey, that particular young man or young woman will be apprenticed by the hunter who's very good at gathering honey at the top of trees, and so forth. People learn by hanging out with people who are good at it already, and being taught day by day, the micro and the macro of that particular set of practices. And they're expected to get better at it through trial and error, making mistakes, learning from their mistakes, having somebody back them up over time. And that continues to be the primary mode of real education. When we parent children, most of the practical education we give children is through getting them to learn from their own experience.
Yeah.
And then having constant feedback loops of, okay, well, why don't you try it this way, honey, and try it that way, honey. And, it may be kicking a ball into the net. It may be shooting a ball through a hoop or hitting a ball with a bat, or it could be, painting a drawing or playing a musical instrument. You can't learn a musical instrument. I grew up playing music only by listening to music or reading books on music. You've got to literally pick up the instrument and start making a mess and making sound. And over time, then, with proper supervision, in a sense, the same apprenticeship model, but maybe formalized in weekly lessons, you begin to learn that craft.
Yes.
So I approached leadership in that way.
It's much more of almost I think of problem-based learning, right? That's also embedded in medical education. But yes, we need to, you wouldn't want the pilot that said, I've read a lot of books about piloting.
Right. That's right. You'd want him to be spend a lot of time in a simulator crashing.
Yeah.
and
you create that simulator.
Right. When we look at the spectrum of methods that have been developed to help people learn from experience, and we look then at the history of professional education, in different professional schools, there is a rich set of methodologies. When law schools teach by the case method, the law school version of the case method, they're learning from experience. They're looking at actual historical legal cases, and they're analyzing them and trying to retrace the reasoning of the judges and the judicial experts at the time. And the same thing in business school case method that was pioneered at Harvard, in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, or maybe it was in the 50s. But when they courageously said, we're going to teach everything by the case method, even finance, we're going to teach by the case method. And the analytic type said, how can you possibly do that? But their point was, we want to teach people how to do finance, how to do budgeting. Let's have it be problem-centered. And in a sense, then there is a spectrum of experiential methods that go from, one could say, the most tame and controlled kinds of, like the Harvard Business School case method, that's widely employed in business schools all over the world, is a very tame methodology. Tame because the case has been pre-prepared. It's been studied ahead of time by the faculty. There are teaching notes from other faculty how to teach it. And even though it feels like an improvisation in the classroom, and is to some extent an improvisation, usually the faculty member has a fairly good sense of, by minute 13, I want to have covered this. By minute 26, I want to have covered that. This blackboard will be covered with this kind of information, and this other blackboard with this other kind of information, and so forth, as they orchestrate people's conversation through the case. So that's at the tame end. And the methods of experiential education that you experienced in that program which I've been using both in semester-long courses, in 2-week intensives, as well as in short forms like your 8-day workshop or like smaller workshops of 1 or 2 days, on consulting assignments. These are 2 basic different kinds of methodologies, and I'd like to describe each one. The first one is a quite logical extension from the formal case method. The key difference is that I have students analyze their own cases. So I have them prepare a case from their own life experience, generally professional experience, but with some of the younger students, occasionally it's a personal experience. And I'll have them present their case in a small group. They're generally given an hour and a half or so in the small group, where the whole session is devoted to the rest of the members of the group consulting to that case. And then in our plenary class or in sections with the course coach, they debrief their case analysis and how that group did in trying to analyze that case. And then at the end of the term, they'll write a final paper, analyzing that case, drawing on the framework they've learned in the course to analyze that case in the hope that they will come up with new options.
Yes.
I should have done that. I could have tried that. I don't know if it would have worked, but at least my imagination of the option set is expanded. And I want people to focus on 2 different sets of options. Diagnostic options. This is how I should have gone about investigating the situation differently. I assumed X, but I never really checked it out. I didn't have the courage to go talk to Y person, but I really needed to talk to Y person somehow, or find a workaround, because I can't get quick access to Y by talking to people who know Y, but I need that information. And getting people to spend sufficient time on the diagnostic search process for collective problem solving, where you have to get information around the full ecosystem of the parties that have a stake in that collective problem, is a very common source of failure, the failures of that diagnostic search process. So I want them to expand their options.
Great.
And then on the action side, I want to expand their options on their strategy and tactics of how they tried to move the ball down the field on that collective problem. So that's the first. And I would say of the 2 teaching methods that I have spent the most time trying to develop, that is actually the most readily available to instructors on leadership or trainers on leadership. It's hard because you have to have mastered the framework well enough, whatever framework you're working with, to analyze a case for which you've had no preparation.
Yes.
And then to think out loud with people. Well, this is the algorithm. These are the key questions that I ask. This is why I ask these questions. These are the patterns that I'm looking for in this case in trying to help this person see new options. One needs to know one's own framework well enough to take a case fresh and think out loud with people, helping them discover new options in that live consultation.
Yes.
But the benefit of doing that is that the students or the trainees in a training program see your analytical process, including the floundering around.
Yes.
Which is important, because in analyzing any, trying to make sense of any situation with its blooming confusion, you need to have the stomach to flounder around, to try this, to try that, to try this frame, to try that frame, to zoom out, a level of analysis, to zoom back in, to reframe the problem itself in one way or another way. By thinking out loud on the case analysis with the students, they learn, in a sense, as an apprentice, how one might go about thinking through complex cases that are not pre-digested for you. And the reason why I think it's so key is because in their practical lives, they're not going to come across cases that are pre-digested for them.
Yes.
They're going to have to figure out how to think on their feet when they're faced with a confusing situation with some algorithm or some, list of key questions to ask themselves, a method of investigation to begin to unpack that case and come up with better options.
As a musician, you understand all too well that necessity to improvise. In the first example, I can have everything buttoned up. I can look like the expert. I know the answers. I know what's on the blackboard. And to your point, that kind of floundering around, even some of that work, that messiness, it's real. It's much more real than
Yes.
kind of the plastic prepackaged version, right?
Yes.
So you're moving up the spectrum of tame to, I don't know, tame light.
Yes. Yes. Using student cases is much less tame than using pre-prepared cases.
Yeah.
For two reasons. It's personal.
Mm-hmm.
It's really personal. The person who you're asking to present a case is engaging in a vulnerability.
Yes.
They're sharing a real situation that they've struggled with. And in my assignment, I have them pick a case of failure because I think that if they can actually learn from the failure, those lessons will stick with them and be much more readily transferred into practice. Now, we look at successes too, but the student cases, I want them to look at failure, and they have to overcome some amount of fear of embarrassment or shame in sharing a case of failure with their colleagues.
Yes.
But when they do overcome that and in creating the conditions for that level of vulnerability, the learning is really pretty profound. Sometimes students don't unpack their own case until they write the final paper on it.
Okay.
At the end of the term, when it's quiet and it's just them, writing a 10, 20-page final paper, analyzing their case. How do they see it differently on the diagnostic side and on the action side? And what, in retrospect, should they have tried that they hadn't thought of trying when they lived that case? The second reason why it's less tame is it's less tame for the faculty member.
Yes.
You've got to be willing to make mistakes in your own case analysis in front of the students.
Yes.
And help them learn from, well, that was a dead end. Let's try something else. But that in and of itself is very important because you want to give people a sense of experimental mindset.
Yes.
To the analysis of leadership cases, where they're willing to move from version 1.1 to 1.2 to 1.3 without shame of needing to mid-course correct. And so I try to model that.
Well, and I love in the diagnostic of the case, there's also, and you've mentioned this, but there's emotion there, which is just nudging us closer to the real thing, getting a little bit closer to the simulation. But if it's something where it was a failure, it's likely that there's a strong emotion tied to that, yes, which is nudging us closer to the real deal, right?
Yeah. Yes. Now, I would say that the usual simulations that people use, like various games or exercises, are also on that spectrum towards experiential, from didactic on one end to experiential on the other.
Yes.
It's on that spectrum. I think the formal sort of simulations that people commonly employ are also powerful in capturing some lessons. I would put them kind of in between the business school case method and student cases.
Yes.
And the reason why is the simulation has a feeling of reality to it in the sense that people are living a real, but it's a pretty contained frame of reference. It's here are the rules of the game. Now you're going to learn from how you and your colleagues collaborate or have failures of imagination or failures of collaboration and work in that collective problem. Now, again, there's a lot to learn from that if it's debriefed properly, but it's still more tame than, and in teaching negotiation, that would be a typical thing using simulations, simulated negotiations. But having a student's own real case from their own life is less tame than even a simulation because they really have lost sleep on that failure.
Yes.
For them, the stakes were sometimes very high. Some of our students in our mid-career program or in our executive program have lived through some heavy pieces of history.
Yes.
So the regrets and the shame, the sense of lost opportunity is very, very real. And even for a young person where the case doesn't seem quite as significant as it might to an older person, where maybe it's a case of an injustice in a classroom or in a summer camp or in a summer job, for that student, it's real.
Yes.
Further along the spectrum, what you called a simulation, I don't put exactly in the same category as a simulation, but it's a method that I've called case-in-point method. And This also is based on people learning from experience. But instead of learning from debriefing and analyzing a past experience from their own professional or personal life, I'm having people learn from their present experience. So the classroom itself is a present experience. It has its own dynamic. Mary says something perfectly smart and nobody pays attention. 10 minutes later, Jack says the same basic thing and everybody pays attention.
Yeah.
That's a very common dynamic of invisibility and credibility, differential credibility. So in using the class as a case, we can stop the action and say, pause, and say, let's debrief what just happened here. Isn't this interesting? Let's contrast what happened to Mary with what happened to Jack. And then let's do what in medicine would be called a differential diagnosis. What are the diagnostic options? How would we assess the different possibilities to explain why that happened? And then we'll have a conversation. Well, maybe it's a matter of timing. Maybe it's a matter of that her mode of expression had much more emotional spin in it, and Jack's was much more dispassionate, and that fit the culture. Maybe it was gender, maybe it was a prejudice, and maybe it was timing. Maybe it's just timing, that she spoke up a little premature in the flow of the conversation. And when that theme came around again, a third time, that's when Jack spoke up again. And in a sense, the issue had been ripened in the conversation. Now, I want students not to jump for the most convenient diagnosis, which is, well, this is obviously sexism. It may be, it often is, but it also could be one of the other possibilities. So the classroom itself ends up manifesting a lot of the common organizational and political dynamics, social dynamics that we see in our own organizational and social lives. How some people are given more authority, informal authority in the class than others. Maybe because of their prior jobs, because of their stance, because of their body, because of the way they look, because of their accent, because of their skin color or ethnicity or gender. Conflict dynamics. You'll get a conflict emerging in the class, and we can stop the action. We can say, okay, what happened there?
Yes.
How can we render this to be more productive? Because right now it's really going south fast. Authority dynamics. When I'm teaching Case-in-Point, I'm the authority figure in the classroom. By definition, I'm authorized by the university to be the instructor for the course. And the students, by selecting my course as an elective, they are also authorizing me to be their teacher.
Yes.
So I have the authorization to be teacher. So now I'm the authority figure. But, like right now, I'm teaching a class on anti-Black racism and sexism. I am a white, cis, heterosexual man, American, older, in a very diverse classroom with people from 40 countries, more than 100 people, many of whom are exquisitely sensitive to injustice generated by people who have the identities that I embody. And so using me or us as a case in point says, okay, well, let's look at the trust dynamics in here.
Wow.
The trust is obviously going to be more brittle. I mean, you come to me with distrust from all the scar tissue you have from violations of trust by authorities in your life or in the lives of people with whom you identify. So let's figure that out. If I make 100 wonderful lessons and then I make a mistake in class by calling somebody by the wrong name, what do you gravitate to? What happens to my credibility? Okay, that's interesting. Now, how should somebody in my position try to repair trust? So, the classroom itself becomes a case in point for illustrating and teaching many of the kinds of properties of social systems and the dynamics in social systems that they're going to have to deal with in the practice of leadership in mobilizing collective learning or collective problem solving.
And Ron, at least as I recall, you said something to the effect in the cohort that I was in 2006, and it's always stuck with me. I may be a little harsher in my memory of this, and I'm sure you have a better way of saying this, but you said, I'm not a huge fan of creating safe spaces, in that my students are going back to, in many cases, not safe spaces. And leadership, in many cases, is not a safe activity. It's you're disrupting systems, you're disrupting people. And are you still thinking about it in that same way? Does it still get fairly heated at times within the
Yes.
context? Because, in our session, emotions were flaring at times. And
Yes.
you create an environment that really does, to your point, in the present, whether it was an FBI agent or the hospital president, they didn't know how to intervene skillfully in that
Right.
moment.
Right. Because most of us don't. In
Yes.
fact, it's a frontier in leadership research is beginning to capture lessons from people who've done a little better in the art form
Yes.
of orchestrating heated conflict in a community. So, yes, I do not try to create a padded cell
Okay.
in which people bang themselves against the wall and cannot get hurt. People will hurt each other's feelings. Gender discrimination, prejudices of all kinds towards gay, heterosexual, LGBTQ people, ethnic prejudices, racial prejudices will emerge in the classroom dynamic because they're always there anyway. The only difference in the way I teach is that I allow them to surface and become a subject of conversation.
Mm.
And then say, great, this is the kind of challenge you're going to be facing and the kind of cultural changes you're trying to seek in your leadership aspirations. So let's see what we can learn from our own class as a case. I do try to keep it safe enough, but not completely safe. One of my colleagues described it not as a safe space, but a brave space. It does take courage to learn publicly, but I want students to know what it means to learn publicly, because I think collective problem solving often involves and requires people to learn publicly, to learn out loud, to be willing to change their minds as they're being engaged with a contrary point of view, sometimes said heatedly,
Ron, can you think of a story of a time where you had to learn publicly that you can share, where literally you made a mistake and in real time had to say, that probably was not a wise decision. What do I do?
Well, it happens almost every day. I mean, I learn the whole approach to leadership theory and the conceptual, the layers of conceptual construction that I've been trying to do and pushing our frontier a little farther out happens mainly in the classroom. Students pitch me a hard question and I have to think on my feet and I come up with an idea and then I test it out against their cases.
Yeah.
Which keeps me honest because it's not the blind leading the blind. My ideas have to prove their value against real cases. Now, some of the painful times where I've made some real mistakes and I've had to learn from, I remember once in a workshop, it was a short workshop with people training to become inner city school principals, mainly in Black urban schools. And half the cohort of these people in this executive education program, this was not in Massachusetts, it was actually in Ohio, where you are.
Yeah.
Were, I don't know if exactly half and half Black and half white, but it was pretty evenly divided demographically. There were also some Latin American people. They were doing really a pretty lousy job of being able to listen to each other. There was a lot of the oppression Olympics going on. Mm. As people are starved to have their own pain recognized. And some of the white students were, on the one hand, they wanted to be inner city school principals. So a part of them, their heart was really into, helping Black kids learn in schools that are largely with Black kids. But on the other hand, they got impatient with some of their Black colleagues who had a lot to say about their experiences and what Black kids needed based on their experiences. So you had this real impatience in class. And one of the white students began to talk about the trauma of his own personal life. And the Black students were just ignoring him. Now, these were folks who had been already spent 6-7 months together in a program. So, this was not their first encounter with each other. So the mistake I made was I went up to one of the Black women in the section and I put my hands on her shoulders and I said, look at him, look at him, the white man who was sharing very painful set of experiences. And it immediately blew up.
Mm.
Don't you know what it means for a white man to put his hands on a black woman, and to say, pay attention to the white man who's speaking. And the black students all coalesced immediately, circling the wagons. And it got extremely hot and very, very challenging to me. I mean, I felt like I really needed time to think about what happened. So I had to talk to myself a lot, at that moment. And I began by sitting down and saying, okay, well, tell me more. And it was hard to hear them talking, the black men talking, but very protective towards the black woman talking, powerful black woman, she had lived a lot of life, but also the traumatic experiences she had had in her life, I had surfaced through my own behavior. It was towards the end of that class session, and so during the lunch break before the next session, I was just really shaken. I mean, literally shaken, in figuring out, how am I going to pull together this, workshop? I have another half day with these folks. This was, I had 4 days with them spread out over a year, one day. This was the very last day. It was 2 days together, one day, and then 2 days together. This was the afternoon or the morning of the second day. And I went to sit in the only place I could get privacy was in the stairwell. And I just sat in the stairwell and really tried to calm myself down and figure out, where do I go from here? I also spoke with one of the other faculty members, and got his point of view. So I had, the benefit of another point of view. He, of course, was completely freaked out because he never used class as a case, and running any pressure cooker with those kinds of pressures and temperatures was completely foreign to him. I mean, he was used to a much more controlled classroom. But nevertheless, it was useful to just air out my thoughts with him and get his perspective. So then when I went back into the classroom, I apologized. But the apology had to connect with her experience, And so I affirmed and spoke about what I imagined this must have meant to her. And I was really sorry that I hadn't anticipated that. I did not try to then say, okay, but here was my point. Because when you're trying to repair trust, you can't then say, okay, now that we've done that, now let me tell you how I was right. And it was important for you to listen to that white guy. Because, the only task at hand is repairing the breach. And maybe later you get another chance to teach the lesson point,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that she really appreciated it, and then later in the afternoon, this guy spoke up again and he poured his heart out. And I think it blew everybody's mind, because I think they were more ready to listen to him. She walked out with me to the car waiting to take me to the airport. Well, they gave me a standing ovation, at the end of and she did. And she came out and she said, wow, nobody's ever apologized to me that way. I can't tell you how much it meant to me. So, I mean, it was a very moving experience for me. I mean, I think she was being extraordinarily generous. And I mean, it's a bit tragic that, in her life experience, she must have been at least 35 years old, that she hasn't had a white person apologize to her that way before. I mean, I shouldn't have been special. I was only special because in her life experience, it was a rare event. It shouldn't be a rare event. But it was a really hard case in point for breaching trust, violating a trust, and then needing to repair the breach.
And I think that's in some ways some of the fear for educators, right? I mean, you have spent decades crafting this and really working very intentionally and critically reflecting on how to do this work. It's an art form in many ways, because that improvisation, in many ways, it's an act of leadership as well. again, that improvisation, that we don't have everything buttoned up. We don't have everything locked down. It's not clean. It is messy. And I did after we did our 2006 event, I was doing a version of Case-in-Point, a very light version. But I would tell the students, hey, I want you to accomplish a Guinness World Record. It's 15% of your final grade. Go for it. And oh my gosh, well, what do we do to achieve a Guinness World Record? Go for it. Right?
Yeah.
I just kind of laid that out there to, and it's 15% of the final grade. And every course concept bubbled up, whether that was the sources of stress, sources of power, leadership styles, followership styles. Yeah. We just had so many different course dynamics embedded in that one activity that they became the case study, right?
I love it. Yeah.
And they never did not achieve the Guinness World Record, Ron. It was beautiful. Now, there's some low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
But it was my light version of at least trying to help them become the case, help them pause and observe the own dynamics in the room, help them better understand that, and get out of this kind of headspace and more into the emotion, more into the, this faction of people aren't doing what we need them to. Okay, so what are your options? What are you gonna try?
Yeah.
And how do you do that work? And so I've done variations of it, but that's great. It's stressful though, right? I mean,
it can be at the highest pressures, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ways to use Case-in-Point method with a very light touch. Because if you wanted to teach about authority dynamics, for example, and you had a set of ideas about the nature of authority relationships, you could simply ask in class, okay, well, how are we a case like where does my authority come from? And it's mainly an intellectual conversation, but you are using the class as a case. So it's a little bit more of a living case.
Yes.
But it's very tame. And now it interests me, how long did you spend debriefing, that exercise in class so that you can capture the lessons from the experience of trying to go for a record?
So we would usually spend an evening kind of celebrating that they achieved their objective, and then reflecting and trying to make sense of what we just experienced. It was never enough. It always felt rushed. And I've used other variations, Ron. I would share a list of 40 things for the students to accomplish as a team, as a group. Let's say there's 17 or 25 people in the class. I would give them a list of 45 things. Let's say the topic was ethics. So I would say interview 5 Fortune 500 CEOs on the topic of ethics, a sitting US senator or congressman, the president of the university, the lieutenant governor or the governor, the mayor of Cleveland. And then it would be 40 things, and it would just overwhelm them. But again, they always accomplished it. Yeah. They had a mindset in the beginning of, well, we can't, how are we ever going to get to a Fortune 500 CEO? And pretty quickly, they have 7, Ford and Nestle. Right? And
it's fantastic.
It built there. Great. But again, we would pause, we would slow down. And so it was a lot of pausing in real time. But then as you know, I became the focus of their frustration much of the time. And I was doing this to them, and that's where I would experience some stress at times, because I too didn't know how. Now I was using, admittedly, a higher risk version. As soon as I'm labeling 15% of their final grade to this assignment, I'm using a tool with some pretty good heat, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't want listeners to think that it always has to be that hot, because I think your point is perfect.
That's right. You can dial it to whatever level you want, depending on what dynamic you want to pay attention to, which ones to keep your hands off of, because it's too hot to handle. It's not ripe right now. The structure's not long enough. Like if I had a week with people, but I only have a day with people, or I'm near the end of the term, and if I'm going to shake it up, I should shake it up earlier in the term so that I have time to weave it back together. Those all become important determinants of how hot and I just, in regard to the debriefing of experiences, I have the same experience you have, that we frequently don't leave enough time for the debriefing, that the real learning comes as a combination of the experience, the raw experience itself, but then the debriefing of it. So that, because that's where the ideas, but where the experiential lessons become turned into ideas and concepts that can then get retained in memory. I remember consulting to Outward Bound early in my career, where they get people to have all these experiences, but they only would debrief them like for a half hour at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I said, no, the ratio is wrong. Spend a lot more time debriefing the experiences each day, because that's where the lessons get captured. I also told them, don't give people mountains they can climb, give people mountains they cannot climb, so that they can debrief failure. And then, because that's going to be more realistic. Thank you so much, Scott, for this conversation.
Yeah, I'll tell you one quick story and then we can kind of wind down our time. But it was hilarious, Ron. They had 7 Fortune 500 CEOs, Progressive, Key Bank, we've got Ford, Nestle USA, and they couldn't get the university president. This is a 3,000 student,
Yeah.
They've got the lieutenant governor, the mayor.
Right.
And I just looked at them in one of these moments, they were so proud. And I said, figure it out.
Isn't that great?
What are your options?
Fabulous. I love that.
Because I'll never forget one of the students, George, he said on the last night when it was due, he said, we got it. I was just at the holiday party. I cornered the president and asked him about ethics.
Fantastic. That's so great. Yeah, everybody's going to really be responsive to students wanting to learn about their leadership, except a schoolhouse where students are common. Who needs to give students time to students? But
as we wind down our time real quick, Ron, is there anything that's caught your eye recently, what you've been streaming or reading or listening to that listeners might be interested in?
Oh, wow. There's so much good stuff. I've been spending the last 5 or 6 years going to classes on evolutionary biology.
Oh, wow.
And just putting on my blue jeans and sitting with the college kids, learning and trying to understand from nature and how innovation happens in nature. Are there lessons from that domain that can be applied as a metaphor to our domain of cultural evolution, cultural change, organizational change, and the practice of leadership to mobilize it? There's so many wonderful things to read. Just recently, I started reading a wonderful book that has all sorts of lessons in it that actually came out 10 years ago by a guy named Stephen Johnson, called Where Good Ideas Come From.
Okay. Yeah.
A wonderful book. And where he's doing just that. He's taken from, stories of evolution, but applied to innovation, creativity. It's not particularly about leadership per se, but I think it's actually one of the key constructs within a good leadership framework is thinking about theories of change, thinking about theories of innovation, and the generation of good ideas. So
I love that. Modeling the lifelong learner. There's a great book that I just finished, Epstein, Range, How Generalists Thrive in a Specialized World. But essentially, he goes to a number of different, similar to your experience of being a medical doctor, psychiatrist, and moving into leadership education. That experience in this domain revolutionized this domain and it transformed it. Right. So it's a really interesting read if you get a chance. Epstein, and it's called Range. So
fantastic.
Sir, thank you for the great work you do.
Take care. Yeah.
Okay. Be well. And
stay safe.
I hope you will come back for the 200th episode.
I look forward to it.
Okay. Be well. I feel so lucky to have had some just transformational leadership experiences. One, Xavier University, my graduate program, and two, Antioch University, my Ph.D. program, just fundamentally shifted and transformed how I see this topic of leadership. And a third has to be my experience at Harvard's Art and Practice of Leadership Development with Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky. It was an incredible 7 to 8 days of learning and experiential learning. I have so much respect for the work of Ron Heifetz. He is, as he mentioned, kind of trying to push the boundaries, helping us thinking about theory, helping us think about how we teach and how we better prepare individuals to be successful when leading in formal or informal ways. I just really enjoyed that conversation and can't thank Ron enough for his time. A great way to round out 100 episodes. Now, in the coming episodes, there'll be some opportunity for reflection. But if there's one word that summarizes these first 100, as I look at the list of guests, as I look and feel humbled at the individuals that I've had an opportunity to be in conversation with, the word for me is just learning. Each week, I am learning so much. Each week, I am amazed at how little I know, how much more there is to know, and how much further I have to go. And as Chip Shoba beautifully said, look, this is a mountain with no top. And I think that could not be more true. But I also come back to a quote in my episode with Doug Lindsay, who you are is how you lead. He attributed that to Dr. Hogan. You know what? I can't agree with that more. Who you are is how you lead. And those are a couple things that just continue to stay with me. Of course, there are other quotes that really, truly stand out of these 100 episodes, but this is a mountain with no top, and who you are is how you lead. As always, everyone, thank you so much for listening. I am so appreciative. And of course, as we move into the next 100 episodes, please reach out, provide feedback, share your thoughts and your perspectives on some conversations you'd like to hear, and we can make that happen. Be well. Take care. Bye-bye. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.